For more than a century, it stood on the shores of Lake Simcoe. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where families could send their most vulnerable loved ones and trust that they would be protected, sheltered, cared for. The province promised that. The province was wrong. Hey, Case Filers, welcome back. Or if you're new here, welcome to Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files. I'm your host, Kate, and I'm so glad you're here with me. But before we begin, I need to take a moment to be honest with you about what we're about to walk into. This episode contains detailed descriptions of neglect, physical and sexual abuse, restraint, and institutional mistreatment of children and adults with disabilities. These are not easy stories to hear. I myself struggled with some of this research, but I believe these voices deserve to be heard. Listener discretion is strongly advised. In this episode, I have also included clips from the former Ontario Premier, Kathleen Wynne, and her apology speech in the Ontario Legislature on December 9th, 2013. Let's dig in. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not to a crime scene with yellow tape and detectives. Not to a suburban house with a locked basement. Let's go back to 1876. Canada is 9 years old. A baby nation, really. Sir John A. Macdonald is in power. The railway is still a dream sketched on paper. And in the small town of Huronia, Ontario, nestled between two lakes, a place known today for its summer cottages and its opera house, a grand new institution opens its doors. It was called the Huronia Asylum for Idiots. You heard me correctly. That was the official name, the name on the cornerstone, the name in the provincial records. That word, the one we would never use today, was stamped onto the lives of thousands of human beings. Children mostly, some as young as 5 years old. Now, I want you to understand something important. This was not an asylum for the mentally ill in the way we think of Victorian asylums today. Bedlam, the snake pit, the madhouse. No. This was something different, something arguably more insidious. This was a facility for people labeled as having developmental or intellectual disabilities. Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and the catch-all diagnosis that was popular at the time, idiocy. In the late 19th century, the experts, the doctors, the reformers, the politicians had a very clear idea about people like this. They believed that disabled people could not thrive in society. They saw them as burdens, as dangerous, as uneducable. The solution? Segregation. Hide them away. Put them somewhere out of sight. Somewhere the rest of the world wouldn't have to think about them. Now here's what's interesting and also heartbreaking. The asylum's founding philosophy was built on something reformers called moral treatment. The idea was that disabled people could be trained in basic skills, kept clean, housed, protected from a cruel and uncomprehending world. It sounded noble on paper, but from the very beginning, there was a darker current running beneath those words. This wasn't just about care, this was about hiding. Let me read you something that still makes my blood run cold. Records from the early years show that children as young as 5 were admitted to the Aurelia Asylum for Idiots. Some were sent by parents who had been told there was no other option, no other hope, no other future for their child. Others were committed by doctors, by social workers, by the courts. And once those children crossed the threshold, once that heavy oak door closed behind them, the outside world ceased to exist. Parents were told to forget their children, to move on, to have other children. The province encouraged families to cut ties completely. Visiting was actively discouraged. You couldn't just show up and see your child. You had to apply. You had to wait. And sometimes your request was simply denied. Letters were delayed. Sometimes they were never delivered at all. And in the most devastating cases, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, some parents were told their child had died when they hadn't. That's not hyperbole. That's not dramatic license. That's documented fact. In 1925, a mother from Toronto wrote to the superintendent at Aurelia. She was asking about her son. He'd been admitted at age 7. She hadn't heard from him in 3 years. The reply she received was cold, clinical, almost cruel in its dismissal. The response? Quote, "Your son is well. It is best you do not visit. It upsets him and disrupts our routine. We will contact you if necessary." Unquote. Imagine being that mother. Imagine receiving that letter. Imagine spending the rest of your life wondering if your child was really well, wondering if you would ever see them again, wondering if the province, the government you trusted, was telling the truth. By the 1930s, the asylum was already a nightmare of overcrowding. Built for 300 people, it held nearly 800. Children slept on bare mattresses on the floor. They were stacked in dormitories, crammed together in rooms that smelled of urine and sickness. Tuberculosis swept through the wards. Influenza, dysentery. And the original promise of moral treatment, of care and protection, had rotted away into something far worse. To understand Huronia, you have to understand the everyday, the routine, the grinding, relentless horror of life inside those walls. Now, I've spent some time going through survivor affidavits from the class action lawsuit, internal ministry reports, and testimony given to the Ontario Ombudsman. I've read transcripts that made me close my laptop and just stare at the wall for a while. What emerges from all of it is not a story of isolated incidents. It's a story of systematic neglect, a landscape of suffering that was not accidental, but structural, built into the very bones of the institution. Let me tell you about one resident. We'll call her Sarah, though that's not her real name. Sarah arrived at Huronia when she was 6 years old. In her testimony years later, she remembered holding her mother's hand on the front steps. Quote, "My mother was crying. A nurse took me by the arm and said, 'Say goodbye now.' My mother tried to hug me, but they pulled me away. I didn't see her again for 14 years." Unquote. That's just one story, and there are thousands more. Let me walk you through what life was like decade by decade. Residents lived in massive dormitories called wards, segregated by age and perceived level of functioning. Each ward held 50 to 100 people, sometimes more. It was like living in a crowded, screaming, weeping barracks. At night, you could hear everything: the crying, the screaming, the thud of someone falling out of bed because there were no side rails, no safety, no comfort. In the 1950s, a provincial inspector wrote a report that was kept from the public for years. In it, he described conditions that were utterly appalling. Quote, "Odors of urine and feces pervasive. Bedding unchanged for up to 1 week. Many residents in states of undress. Staff ratio 1 attendant for 60 residents." Unquote. Think about that. 1 attendant for 60 residents. 60 people, many of them children, many of them with complex medical needs, depending on a single staff member for their basic care: food, bathing, toileting, dignity. It was impossible. It was inhuman. And it was the policy. Here's another quote from another resident. "We wore the same clothes for days, sometimes weeks. If you wet the bed, they would put you in a cold shower in front of everyone. They called it hydrotherapy. It was punishment." Unquote. Now, I need to tell you about something that has haunted me since I first read about it: the caged cribs. These were adult-sized cribs. Think of a hospital crib, but larger, enclosed with wire mesh or wooden slats on top, like a cage. A cage for a human being. Residents were locked inside these cribs for hours, sometimes for entire days. If they were deemed aggressive, if they were acting out, if they had a seizure, if they were having a bad day, if staff simply didn't want to deal with them, One survivor quoted, "They put me in a caged crib when I was 12. I had a seizure. They said I was acting out. I lay there for 18 hours. I couldn't turn over. I couldn't call out because they would come and hit me. So I just stared at the ceiling." Unquote. These caged cribs were not a secret. They were photographed in the 1960s by a Toronto Star reporter. The province promised to phase them out. Yet they remained in use until the 1980s. And if you think the caged cribs were bad, wait until you hear about the medication. In the 1970s, Huronia became known for its heavy use of psychotropic drugs. Thorazine, Haldol, Valium, powerful antipsychotics and sedatives that were never intended for children, and certainly never intended for the dosages being given. Residents were medicated not for their own benefit, but for crowd control. One internal memo from 1972, entered into court evidence years later, reads as follows. A doctor, name is redacted, has ordered routine sedation for Ward 4 every evening at 6 p.m. This is to facilitate easier bed preparation and reduce nighttime wandering. Dosage: adult levels regardless of age or weight." Unquote. Think about that. Adult levels regardless of age or weight. That meant children as young as 8 were being given powerful antipsychotics every single night. Doses meant for full-grown adults. The result? They were chemically pacified, zombified, made docile and compliant. Many developed permanent movement disorders, tardive dyskinesia, a neurological condition that causes involuntary twitching and jerking, often irreversible. Some lost the ability to speak. Now, I have to talk about the part of this story that is the hardest to recount. But it must be told because it happened. It happened to children, it happened to adults, and it has allowed to continue for decades. Court filings and survivor interviews describe a culture where female residents and some male residents were sexually abused by staff, by older residents, and by outside visitors brought in for that purpose. A resident named MK stated, quote, "A male attendant took me to the laundry room at night. He said if I told anyone, I would go to the quiet room for a month. I was 13. That went on for 2 years." Unquote. The quiet room. That was another name for a concrete cell. Bare walls, a mattress on the floor, no window. The door locked from the outside. Residents could be kept there for days. And when MK finally tried to report the abuse to a supervisor, She was told this, quote, "You're a liar. You just want attention. Go back to your ward or I'll put you in restraints." Unquote. There is no meaningful way to report abuse at Huronia. No ombudsman, no independent oversight, no one who could intervene on behalf of the residents. The only authorities were the very people committing or enabling the harm, and for generations, no one outside was listening. By the 1960s, the rest of the world was changing. Deinstitutionalization movements began in the United States and Europe. Parents of disabled children started forming advocacy groups. There were whispers at first faint, then growing louder, that maybe, just maybe, these institutions were not the answer. But in Ontario, Huronia kept growing. In 1966, the facility reached its peak population, 2,600 residents. By then, it had become a small, brutal city inside a fence. I was there from 1962 to 1985, another survivor had said. 23 years. I watched children come in at 5 years old and die at 40. Never having left the grounds. Never having seen a tree outside the fence. Never having been hugged by someone who cared. Unquote. Let me read you something. This is from a 1975 report by the Ontario Ministry of Health. It was obtained through Freedom of Information decades later. Quote, Huronia Regional Center is operating under conditions that would not be acceptable in any modern long-term care facility. Bedbugs are endemic. Toilets are frequently blocked. Food is often cold and nutritionally inadequate. Staff morale is low, and turnover exceeds 40% annually. Numerous complaints of physical mistreatment remain unsubstantiated due to lack of investigation. End quote. Unsubstantiated. That word appears again and again in these documents. Again and again, the reports would note that there had been complaints, but that the complaints were unsubstantiated. What that really means is no one looked. Huronia had a classroom, nominally, but most residents received no education at all. Those who were capable of learning, who had the cognitive ability to read, to write, to do basic math, were instead put to work. Laundry, kitchen, cleaning the wards. This was called occupational therapy. A resident named David stated, quote, I wanted to learn to read. I asked a teacher. She laughed and said, You'll never need to read. You'll die here. I was 9, unquote. David did learn to read in the end. He taught himself by looking at labels on cans in the kitchen, by memorizing bus signs when he was allowed to go on the occasional outing. He was discharged at age 42, functionally illiterate by any formal measure, but able to sound out the words on a street sign. Hundreds of residents are believed to have died at Huronia. Some from natural causes, yes, old age, and illness. But many died from neglect, untreated infections, dehydration, falls, choking, and what the records called sudden unexplained death. On the grounds of Huronia, there are multiple institutional cemeteries. Grave markers, if they exist at all, are often just numbered stones, no names. Because the province did not always return bodies to families. Because sometimes, and I want you to really hear this, families had been told to forget. In 2009, a historian began mapping the Huronia burial sites. He found more than 400 graves. Only a fraction had names. One marker read simply, "Infant, unknown." That infant had been a resident. That infant had a mother somewhere. And that mother likely spent her entire life wondering what happened to her child. For decades, survivors tried to speak. In the 1980s, a few residents wrote letters to the Aurelia Packet and Times. The letters were polite. They asked for better food, for a chance to leave the grounds, for someone to investigate the attendant who hit them. The newspaper published some. The province ignored them. Then, in the 1990s, support groups like People First of Canada began collecting first-hand accounts. They traveled across the province, meeting with survivors, recording their stories. They built a case. But it wasn't until 2010 that everything broke open. That year, a class action lawsuit was filed against the Government of Ontario. The lead plaintiffs were former residents of Huronia, along with survivors of two other institutions, the Southwestern Regional Center in Chatham and the Rideau Regional Center in Smiths Falls. The lawsuit did not seek revenge. It sought three things: compensation, a public apology, and a promise that it would never happen again. For 3 years, the case moved through discovery. Survivors gave sworn affidavits. Historians produced expert reports. The media began paying attention. And then, in 2013, just weeks before the trial was set to begin, the province settled. The total compensation, $35 million. For survivors, the settlement was a mixed victory. On one hand, the government agreed to issue a formal apology in the Ontario legislature. That apology happened on December 9th, 2013. Here is the audio clip. The video will also be shown in this episode on my YouTube channel.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is not lost on me that this afternoon we are doing two very connected things. I am here to speak truth about a painful chapter in our history and to seek reconciliation with all of those who have been harmed. We will then pay tribute to a man who embodied the power of truth and reconciliation. So I draw on that strength as I offer this apology. Mr. Speaker, a government's responsibility is to care for its people, to make sure they are protected and safe. And therein lies a basic trust between the state and the people. It is on that foundation of trust that everything else is built, our sense of self, our sense of community, our sense of purpose. And when that trust is broken with any one of us, we all lose something. We're all diminished. I want to address a matter of trust before this House and my assembled colleagues, but I am truly speaking to a group of people who have joined us this afternoon and to the many others who could not be here today. I am humbled to welcome to the legislature today former residents of the Huronia Regional Centre and Rideau Regional Centre in Smiths Falls, and to also address former residents of the Southwestern Regional Centre near Chatham, along with their families and supporters. I want to welcome all of you, and I want to honor your determination and your courage, and to thank you for being here to bear witness to this occasion. Today, Mr. Speaker, we take responsibility for the suffering of these people and their families. Aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Président,
today, Mr. Speaker, we take the responsibility for the suffering of these people and their families.
I offer an apology to the men, women, and children of Ontario who were failed by a model of institutional care for people with developmental disabilities. We must look in the eyes of those who have been affected and to those they leave behind and say, we are sorry. As Premier, and on behalf of all of the people of Ontario, I am sorry for your pain, for your losses, and for the impact that these experiences must have had on your faith in this province and in your government. I am sorry for what you and your loved ones experienced, and for the pain that you carry to this day. À titre de Premier Ministre et au nom de l'ensemble de
As Ontario's Premier, and in the name of all Ontarians, I apologize for all the sufferings, the losses, and all the impacts that they have had on your confidence in this province and its government. I am sorry for what you and your loved ones must have endured, and for the sorrow that you feel until today.
Some residents suffered neglect and abuse within the very system that was meant to provide them care. We broke faith with them, with you, and by doing so, we diminished ourselves. Over a period of generations and under various governments, too many of these men, women, children, and their families were deeply harmed and continue to bear the scars and the consequences of this time. Their humanity was undermined, they were separated from their families and robbed of their potential, their comfort, their safety, and their dignity. At Huronia, some of these residents were forcibly restrained, left in unbearable seclusion, exploited for their labor, and crowded into unsanitary conditions. And while the model of care carried out by this institution is now acknowledged to have been deeply flawed, there were also cases of unchecked physical and emotional abuse by some staff and residents. Huronia was closed in 2009, when Ontario closed the doors to its last remaining provincial institutions for people with developmental disabilities. Today, Mr. Speaker, we no longer see people with developmental disabilities as something other. They are boys and girls, men and women with hopes and dreams like everyone else. In Ontario, all individuals deserve our support, our respect, and our care. We must look out for one another, take care of one another, challenge ourselves to be led by our sense of moral purpose before all else. Today, we strive to support people with developmental disabilities so they can live as independently as possible and be more fully included in all aspects of their community. As a society, we seek to learn from the mistakes of the past, and that process continues. I know, Mr. Speaker, that we have more to
For
do.
many survivors,
And so we will
that
protect the
apology
memory
meant
of all
everything.
those who have suffered, help to tell their
After
stories,
decades of
and ensure
being
that the
told
lessons
they
of this
were
time
liars,
are not lost. We
after
are so
being
sorry.
told they didn't matter, the province finally said, "We were wrong." But then came the money. The $35 million fund was distributed based on a point system. Survivors had to prove their level of harm through medical records, affidavits, and sometimes interviews with evaluators. A legal analyst stated, quote, "After legal fees, which were substantial, given the complexity of the case, and after administrative costs, some survivors received as little as $2,000. Even those at the highest end of the harm scale received roughly $42,000. For a lifetime of institutionalization, for being beaten, for being sexually abused, for losing your childhood." Unquote. One resident stated, quote, "They gave me $10,000. Do you know what that is? That's 3 months' rent in Toronto. That's what my freedom was worth. They stole 60 years of my life and gave me $10,000. Unquote. The apology was real, but the compensation felt like an insult. And yet, for many survivors, the lawsuit was never just about money. It was about forcing the province to admit the truth. That truth, finally spoken in open court documents and public records, is now undeniable. The Huronia Regional Center officially closed its doors in 2009. The buildings now sit largely abandoned. Though some have been redeveloped for other uses, the main administration building is gone, but the cemeteries remain. In 2015, a group of survivors and advocates returned to the Huronia site. They walked the grounds where they had been confined. They stood in front of the numbered grave markers. One survivor said, quote, "I stood at a stone that said unknown, and I thought, that could be my best friend. Her name was Mary. She came in the same year I did. She died in 1978. I was never told what happened. I never got to go to her funeral. And now no one even knows exactly where she is." Unquote. To this day, the province has not fully exhumed or identified all the remains in the Huronia cemeteries. Families are still searching. One family member of a resident said, quote, "My grandmother was admitted in 1942 when she was 16. She had a mild intellectual disability. She died in 1995, still at Huronia. I never knew her. My mother never spoke of her. It was like she never existed. I only found out because I found a letter in my mother's attic after she died. It was from the superintendent. It said, 'Your mother passed peacefully. No date, no cause, no grave location.'" Unquote. That's the final wound of Huronia. Not just the abuse, not just the neglect, but the erasure, the deliberate, systematic effort to make these human beings disappear from memory. Huronia was not an accident. It was the product of a society that decided some lives mattered less. It was enabled by a province that looked away for 133 years. And it was maintained by silence. The silence of neighbors who never asked what was happening behind the fence. The silence of journalists who didn't dig deep enough. The silence of politicians who accepted bland annual reports without ever visiting the wards. But today, survivors have broken that silence. And it's our job, my job, your job, to listen, to remember, and to ensure that no institution in Canada ever again becomes a place where vulnerable people are hidden, hurt, and forgotten. The Huronia Regional Center is gone, but its legacy remains. There are still former residents living among us, carrying wounds that will never fully heal. There are still graves marked only with numbers. And there are still families who do not know where their loved ones rest. The demolition of the former Huronia Regional Center, HRC, in Aurelia began in mid-December 2025. The process is being carried out in phases and is currently ongoing, with significant progress made in 2026. Here is a timeline of recent demolition dates and milestones. December 2025, demolition commenced. January 2026, Phase 1 of the demolition began. April 2026, reports confirmed that 10 buildings had been fully demolished, with an additional 4 taken down to their foundations. The main administrative building remained standing as it was still occupied. June 2026, work began on demolishing the McGee Apartments, also known as the Pavilion, the largest single structure on the site. The demolition is a multi-phase project. Phase 1 focuses on demolishing 30 to 35 unoccupied buildings and associated underground tunnels. This phase is expected to be completed by the end of 2026. If you or someone you know is a survivor of the institutional abuse in Ontario, support is available. The Huronia Survivor Support Group can be reached through the Archdiocese of Toronto's Restorative Justice Program or through Community Living Ontario. We'll post links in our show notes. And if you have information about other institutions, other places where the vulnerable were hidden, please contact the Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files team. We want to hear those stories. We want to listen. And we want to shine a bright spotlight on cases like these so that what happened at Huronia and at the North Bay Psychiatric Hospital and at the Rideau Regional Center and so many other institutions across Canada can never be forgotten. And more importantly, can never happen again. Please take a moment today to reflect on the children and adults who lived behind those walls. Please remember those who suffered there. And please consider sharing this episode. Awareness is often the first step toward accountability. It is also one of the most powerful tools we have to ensure that history is acknowledged, lessons are learned, and the mistakes of the past are never repeated. One final quote from a former resident. I just want people to know we weren't idiots. We weren't animals. We were children. We were people. And we deserved better. Tell them that. Tell them we deserved better. Unquote. We will. But for now, take care of yourself. These stories are heavy. The darkness in them is real. But so is the light in the world. Don't forget to find it. Call a friend, pet a dog, sit in the sunlight for a few minutes. Take a moment to breathe. Please don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. You can listen on your favorite podcast streaming service. And if you'd like to support the show, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/darkroasttruecrime. Stay tuned for more coffee and more crime. Bye now.